Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. In this video, I'm going to be unpacking the second video of 3 on chapter 6 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science, available with Oxford University Press as an open access book. I already covered the first video, Political Imagination and Advancing the Egalitarian Agenda. In this video, I'm going to connect the concern for equality with translational gerontology to motivate why egalitarians should be concerned with research on the biology of aging. And in the third and final video on chapter 6, I will say a little bit about the medialization of the profession and the challenges that this raises for those doing research on geroscience. As I mentioned in the previous video, I've been working on the topic of the ethics and societal implications of research on the biology of aging for 20 years, and I faced persistent opposition and resistance both among political theorists and bioethicists, and I've been really interested in understanding why there is so much opposition. Resistance, as I note here, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument. And the biggest resistance that I have faced in 20 years of working on this topic is the belief that research on the biology of aging will exacerbate rather than help us redress health disparities. And that is what I hope to address in this video, to show that actually our initial intuitions are unlikely to be a reliable compass on this topic, and actually there's much more potential for experimental science and biology of aging to help us redress health inequalities that we have not been able to tackle effectively in the past. So in the previous video, I covered political imagination. I described a cognitive blind spot that the field of bioethics has to aging and translational science. I gave some historical examples of how past thinkers tried to bring to our attention the persistence of political, racial, and gender inequality of their time. And in a similar way, I'm trying to shed light on the inequality when it comes to biological aging, and that this should be a central focus of bioethics and political theory. And so this will involve unpacking a little bit more specifically how this comes out within medical science. Recall that I describe as an aspiration that science ought to be a moral enterprise, though it often comes up short of that. And this certainly applies to translational gerontology. So we're kind of at a juncture. I believe translational gerontology could be an effective tool in helping us redress some health inequalities, but not necessarily so. It depends on how we deploy the regulation of this translational science, which is why I believe the project that I'm trying to unpack in this book is so critical. And this is the question that I think most people will have, and it's a legitimate question. Who will benefit from translational gerontology, especially the experimental arm of it, the development of drugs that modulate the rate of biological aging? Is it going to be something that only the world's millionaires and billionaires have access to, conferring additional health benefits on them? Or is it something that's going to offer great potential to those that are disadvantaged and face the accelerators of biological aging, whether that come in the form of socioeconomic disadvantage or racial discrimination? And I want to suggest that actually there's a sound empirical basis for believing that actually those that are exposed to the accelerators of biological aging will reap the greatest benefits from gerotherapeutics, provided we pursue the regulation in a way that makes them likely to be widely diffused to disadvantaged populations. And that's going to be the thrust of the argumentation I deploy throughout this chapter. So the Public Health Leadership Society stipulates a number of principles that public health should adopt to ensure that it ethically regulates biomedical innovation. And in particular, I want to draw attention to Principle 4. Public health should advocate and work for the empowerment of disenfranchised community members, aiming to ensure that the basic resources and conditions necessary for health are accessible to all. Now, how does this aspiration apply to translational gerontology, in particular to the development of potential drugs that may slow aging to increase the health span? Recall from previous chapter, I discussed Peter Medawar, the Nobel laureate of medicine, who says that there's two voices of science. There's the actual, and then there's the imaginative, and that these two voices often come into conflict with one another. And I think this is a great way of framing how these issues of equality can be taken in different directions between those who are strong advocates of the actual, which, as I argued in past videos, is the war against disease. So there you would say the idea of focusing on drug innovation for aging is some eccentric pursuit and morally repugnant to prioritize in a world where there's people dying from malaria, cancer, heart disease, stroke, COVID-19, etc. And then you have the imaginative, those that are arguing that there's science that doesn't yet exist but could, and that it would be socially desirable to pursue it because it would be promoting morally laudable aspiration, namely of promoting the healthy longevity of older populations. And I want to kind of pull apart some of the different ways in which these two voices of science express themselves with respect to translational gerontology. I believe you need both voices, though I'm going to come down more in favor of the imaginative side for arguing that translational gerontology can become a very effective tool for helping us redress health disparities. In previous video on chapter 4, I talked about Christian Herder and what he described as science's plastic, the plasticity of science, that is, that our textbooks often make us conservative in our understanding of facts and our aspirations for promoting health. And he described a two-pronged approach to a two-pronged manifestation of imagination and idealism. One is humanitarian medicine, which focuses on the direct and obvious ways of ameliorating human suffering. That's similar to Herder's discussion of the actual. So that's, what can we do right now to promote the health prospects of the vulnerable population? And then there's curiosity-oriented medical science, which pursues pure science without any clear, direct technological application, at least initially. And Herder notes that this science often yields much bigger improvements in population health. And Louis Pasteur is his exemplary example of somebody pursuing curiosity-oriented science, leading to milk pasteurization and vaccinations for anthrax. So in particular, I'm curious about how does Principle 4 apply to curiosity-oriented medical science? If we believe that public health should advocate for the empowerment of the disenfranchised to ensure that they get the basic resources and conditions necessary for health, shouldn't we only be focusing on humanitarian medicine? And I believe that Principle 4 applies to both humanitarian and curiosity-oriented science. We would really have a static, non-plastic view of science in the way that Herder describes if we only believe Principle 4 applied to humanitarian medicine. But we should understand that actually what we consider to be the basic resources and conditions necessary for health will change over time. I'm going to draw an analogy with infectious disease epidemiology as an example of this. So against the conservative, so the conservative throughout this book, I use Michael Oakeshott's characterization of conservatism as the expression of a disposition. They prefer the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the near to the distant, right? So in medical science, that would be somebody who says, well, look, we already have an intervention that can help prioritize that. Why worry about innovations that may be in the pipeline that could come, result in some innovation 20 or 30 years down the road, and the sufficient to the abundant, often expressed in the form of some ageism, where somebody says, well, those surviving past the seventh decade of life already have enough, and let's focus on just ensuring that everybody can make it to age 70, rather than prioritizing the goal of healthy longevity. So this is manifest in what I describe as geroconservatism, which is the main kind of theoretical foe that my book seeks to undermine. That position, in particular, when we focus on drug innovation for aging, articulates the following type of sentiment. With respect to the aspiration to harness experimental science to develop pharmacological interventions in aging, we should instead prefer the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried. So that's a specific medical science articulation of the Michael Oakeshott quotation. And that's what I want to address with respect to equality, because I'm arguing that many egalitarians are proponents of geroconservatism. That is, they only believe in equalizing humanitarian medicine, but not encompassing experimental science as part of their egalitarian expressions or conception of their imagination. And that, unfortunately, is problematic. So if we actually apply Herder's twofold distinction to infectious disease epidemiology, we see that for humanitarian medicine, if we went back in time before the development of vaccinations for particular infectious diseases, we would only focus on the things that were tried and tested in the early stages of the rise of epidemiology, such as quarantining the sick and washing of hands. But Louis Pasteur's research and research on the COVID-19 vaccination, which for many decades was just curiosity-oriented science with no clear medical application, ends up being a real game changer in how you combat the threats from infectious diseases. So now we see equal access to vaccinations as a core expression of Principle 4 with respect to ensuring an equitable approach to the benefits of public health. But if we were very static in only expanding our egalitarian sentiments to humanitarian medicine, none of the innovations of experimental science would apply. So I want to make a similar analogy with healthy aging to what I have here with infectious disease epidemiology, that we need to be expansive in thinking not only about humanitarian medicine being approached in an equal way, but also curiosity-oriented science. And innovations in that respect may prove to be transformative and much more powerful and effective than focusing only on humanitarian medicine. And that certainly applies with infectious disease. If we forfeited the development of vaccinations and simply went with the science of the early 1800s, we would be facing much higher rates of early life mortality from the over 1,400 infectious diseases that can be responsible for the death of humans. So here's another image that I showed from a previous chapter. When we apply Herder's twofold distinction to the paradigm of healthy aging, there's the humanitarian medicine component. And I can tell you from publishing in journals of gerontology and geriatric medicine, so not only do I see the opposition that political theorists have and bioethicists have to arguments about prioritizing the science of healthy aging, I see this unfold in the field of gerontology and geriatric medicine. I've been to many conferences. I've heard, passionate proponents of both sides often talking past each other in exactly the way that Peter Medwar describes between the actual and the imaginative. So the actual would be a geriatrician who focuses on what can you do right now for a patient, in advanced age who is facing some health maladies. So you might focus on things like getting them to stop smoking, making sure they have access to the social determinants of health, ensuring that they're socially connected. And these are all morally laudable and important public health measures. And Principle 4 certainly applies to humanitarian medicine, this component of healthy aging. These are basic resources to ensure that people have access to geriatric medicine, that we promote lifelong learning and improve long-term care for older persons. But it also applies, I would argue, to curiosity-oriented medical science, which is studies on laboratory organisms such as fruit flies, worms, and mice through caloric restriction, genetic manipulation, and now in the final stage, the current stage that we're in, the development of drugs that target the mechanisms of aging, what is called the geroscience hypothesis. I believe Principle 4 must inform this curiosity-oriented science in order for us to reap an egalitarian benefit from this translational science, meaning it could actually help redress the persistent health disparities that exist in the world today, rather than exacerbating them. So this particular expression of geroconservatism is certainly has validity in terms of raising concerns about certainly raise legitimate concerns that geroprotective drugs may not be widely accessible to those who need it the most, meaning those that are exposed to the stressors that accelerate the rate of biological aging. But it does not constitute what Buchanan calls an objection, meaning that we should forfeit the prioritization of experimental science on the biology of aging because our imagination envisions a kind of Frankensteinification of the science, that it will lead to a world of the longevity haves and have-nots. We already live in that world. That inequality is already with us, and it's caused by variations both in genetics and in our environmental exposures and in our lifestyle choices that impact the rate of biological aging in different ways. So geroconservatism sentiment number 2, in particular, is the one that I try to abate in chapter 6. The aspiration to develop safe and effective drugs represents the unknown versus the known ways of increasing health span. The latter include exercise, safe environments, equitable access to the social determinants of health, right? So some of the strongest critics of pursuing the experimental arm of translational gerontology are gerontologists and geriatricians who express only the pursuit of humanitarian medicine, right? That only the things that happen to exist right now to promote the health of older populations should be a priority, not innovation. And that's what I'm trying to critique here. The geroscience hypothesis, when invoked to justify drug innovations in aging, this is the critic speaking, risks distracting our attention away from existing forms of preventative medicine, interventions that could be pursued in the here and now to improve the healthy life expectancy of the disadvantaged. Right? So this is somebody who's broadly sympathetic to the aspiration of healthy longevity, but only to the tried and tested ways of doing that, rather than the experimental arm represented by the pursuit of gerotherapeutics. So in this chapter, I reiterate Nicholas Maxwell's stipulation that wisdom inquiry science should tackle the problems of living. And one of the problems of living that is persistent in all regions of the world is the pervasive health span disparities that exist and persist in the world. So insights from geroscience can actually help us with this diagnostic lens that I emphasized in the last lecture video, that these health disparities arise from variations in the rate of biological aging in many respects, not all of them. And I encourage geroscience to take what I call the intersectional turn, to recognize the complex interplay between genetics, environment, and lifestyle, and a much broader range of more specific exposures that can accelerate the rate of biological aging. So intersectionality has been characterized as both a normative theoretical argument and an approach to conducting empirical research. The more contemporary author, Kimberly Crenshaw, is the one that coined that term and brought it into greater prominence. But there's roots of it in the thoughts both of Anna Cooper and William Du Bois. And I argue that we can actually see geroscientific research as a 21st century articulation of this analytical framework of intersectionality, to recognize that the rate of biological aging varies because of the complex interplay between genetic and environmental factors. So many of these health span disparities arise because of our biology of aging. That socioeconomic disadvantage influences the rate of biological aging. Disparities between white and Black Americans stem to a large extent from differences in exposure to environmental stressors that accelerate the onset of poorer health states on Black Americans at a younger age. And I expand upon this intersectional lens in chapter 7, the next chapter, when I talk about women and the fair innings argument. So that will be a complementary intersectional aspect to this one here. So a little bit more about the science of this. The concept of the exposome, which is, I would argue of equal weight to the genome, was first introduced by Christopher Wilde to bring precision to an individual's environmental exposure, matching the methods used when characterizing the genome. So you have both the genome and the exposome, and it's the interaction of these things that implicate the epigenetics of biological aging. Marginalized populations are at a greater risk of more aggressive cancer tumors, poor cancer outcomes because of the impact of social, environmental, economic, and structural factors have on their biological resilience. Right? I think it's a great insight that captures very eloquently the reality that biological aging is implicated in these health span disparities. And so I capture this here where I try to show, on the one hand, the range of environmental stressors that can accelerate the rate of biological aging. So isolation, racism, lack of education, or smoking, they interact with our genetics to either increase or decrease the human health span. And I have circled in orange here innovation and rate of aging control. So these other non-pharmacological preventative health measures, I would argue, like, we now understand that these are actually implicated in the biology of aging. There's still some debate as to whether or not they just increase health span or actually target the mechanisms of aging. But the intersectional analytic sensibility of translational gerontology allows our imagination to see both the environmental factors like diet, exercise, education, the social structure, whether or not it's a democracy, whether or not it has persistent discrimination based on race or sex or sexual orientation, whether or not it has higher rates of incarceration, which has also been demonstrated to accelerate the rate of biological aging. And then I'm going to just highlight the orange circle, the drug innovation component. What do we want to say about innovation and rate of aging control? What can we do now to ensure the fair diffusion of geroprotective drugs? I think these are another tool of preventative medicine. And like all of the other factors in that previous image, we should seek to ensure that they are widely dispersed to be benefited, in particular by those most vulnerable to the accelerators of biological aging. So the biggest challenge, of course, is going to be, like for all drugs, how expensive are these going to be? And one of the ways we can reduce the likelihood of having, a decade or two of prohibitively costly geroprotective drugs is to prioritize the repurposing of drugs that are already have a long track record for safety. So in particular, metformin and rapamycin, which are two of the most promising drugs in this case, they already have decades of safety data, and they're off patent, meaning you can make generic drugs at a fraction of the cost. So my prescription for trying to promote the egalitarian aspirations of experimental science is to at least prioritize the exploration of repurposing drugs first, because that will make it much more likely that the benefits of translational gerontology are widely dispersed. I think that is the moral obligation that falls on the field of translational gerontology. But not only that, an intersectional analysis can also open our eyes to how we conduct the experimental research as it's beginning to be underdone with humans. And so we need to make sure that the groups in any clinical trials for geroprotective drugs are representative of the population as a whole, and in particular of those that are most vulnerable to some of the health maladies of aging. So I mentioned this Guardian article about most of the experimental research being done in rodents that are male, while half the population are female, and it may not be the case that you can translate experimental research on male rodents to female humans. It may be able to translate it to male humans. So you want to make sure that that experimental research is done on female rodents and not only. And similarly, when you get into drug experimentation in humans, this is being pointed out for recent drug development in Alzheimer's, that it lacked racial diversity, and then that may undermine the efficacy. You want to ensure that those that are most vulnerable to the onset of Alzheimer's disease are actually represented in the clinical trials for the drug's efficacy. So recent criticism has been raised about the underrepresentation of Black and Hispanic participants in clinical trials for the Alzheimer's drug, despite the fact that these groups have higher rates of disease than do whites. So adopting an intersectional lens will help translational gerontology buttress itself from the potential to exacerbate health disparities by ensuring that this translational science will be effective for those who are most in need of drugs that protect them from the onset of disease earlier in life. And I think that's critical to ensuring that the scientific endeavor is a moral enterprise. So that is a pretty expansive survey of some of the issues from equality and translational gerontology. I couldn't do justice to all the details of the points, but I can give you a bird's eye view of some of the argumentation. And in the final video for this chapter, I'll talk a little bit about the trust issue and the medialization of the scientific profession.